The chicken and the bull extortion scheme went something like this. A mark would be sized up in a social setting. He would be approached or set up with a chicken, a young sex worker, a runaway, or a college student, usually between 17 and 20 years old. If the terms were agreeable, the two men would retire to the Mark's hotel room or a suggested second location. The chicken would have been instructed to get himself and the Mark into a comparative state of disarray. Then the bull, masquerading as a police officer, brandishing a badge and occasionally a gun, would burst into the room with the two occupants. The Mark would be told that he had been caught violating the sodomy laws. He was told that there might be another way out of the situation, and that way always meant paying money. If the Mark objected, he would be threatened with exposure, or he'd be taken to the city jail with threats of an overnight stay, which usually produced the desired effect. Some version of this scam was replicated over 1,000 times before it was stopped. The FBI would call the scheme the largest in the United States up to that time. In its wake, lives would be ruined, men would be driven deeper into an already deep closet, and in one instance, a man would take his own life. Thanks for joining me for The Chicken and the Bull. John J. Pyne joined the police department in the 1930s. In the 1950s, he joined the Chicago Police Department's Confidential Squad, a special unit that handled sensitive cases such as blackmail, extortion, and racketeering. There's a fair amount of conjecture about exactly when the chicken and bull scheme started. What seems sure is that John Pyne used the things he learned when it came to extorting money from underground operations, like the underground illegal banks run up in Harlem to launder gambling money, and in this case, the, quote, rolling of queers. The earliest news item I could find was in 1960. It featured the arrest of two men involved in an extortion scheme exactly like what would become the chicken and the bull. They would later be tied to John Pyne. Between 1960 and 1963, Pyne assembled a few men to help him run the operation in Chicago and New York and then across the United States, with Pyne operating behind the scenes, supplying police badges, affidavits, dummy documents, and occasionally access to police stations and jails as part of the con. Pyne's three Confederates, John Fellowbaum, Sherman Kaminsky, and Doss Smith, were the on-the-ground players, recruiting sex workers and runaways to play the chickens. The name Chicken and the Bull came from New York policing vernacular, named for the well-established but piecemeal practice of rolling a queer and extorting money from men who were in the closet. With so many victims, many of them shrouded in mystery after all these years, it's difficult to give a timeline of exactly what happened to who and when. Instead, I'll share some of the victim stories that happened between 1963 and 1966 when the scheme was finally ended. A California nuclear scientist was visiting New York when he was approached by a member of the team. The two men went to a midtown hotel, and as they settled in, two phony cops armed with guns burst into the room, flashing their badges. Playing the long game, the fake cops took the man's credentials and let him leave for the West Coast. A month later, the same phony cops showed up at a secure government research facility where the scientist worked. They confronted him for a cash payment. When they were interrupted by the scientist's supervisor, the scientist introduced the fake cops as two detectives he'd met on his last trip to New York. The supervisor suggested the two men be given a tour of the facility. This feature of the scam was common. Either the sex worker would steal the Mark's money, or the bulls would demand he hand it over. Thinking you'd survived a tawdry ordeal, the bulls would show up later demanding even more money. If you're wondering how the bulls knew when to make a move, according to William McGowan's 2012 piece in Slate magazine, one of the cohorts who worked as the head of hotel security in one of the joints used by the scammers would insert a small dental mirror taped to the end of a cane to better see what was happening in the room. The incident with the scientist wouldn't be the only case of astonishing recklessness. The crew targeted, as the New York Times would later characterize him, one of New York's leading narcotic sellers, whom they had entrapped in the same situation as the scientist. Armed with his identity and personal details, they broke into his apartment and stole $11,000, as well as $100,000 in heroin, which they dumped into a sewer. Eventually, extortion victims would stretch from Mexico to Canada to the United Kingdom. The Marks were people of wealth and means, including a famous musician who some believe was Liberace. The musician categorically refused to get involved when the case was later prosecuted. But to be fair, he wasn't the only person who refused to testify. Neither would the famous Hollywood actor, nor would one of television's most popular entertainers, nor would several captains of industry. Now and then a victim would go to the police. When they did, a cop on the take at that precinct would tip off the gang. The victim would then be threatened with public exposure by the release of a juicy item dropped into a newspaper or magazine by one of the journalists on the gang's payroll. On more than one occasion, a victim was physically assaulted if they resisted paying the demanded funds. In a pre-ATM world, from time to time, if a mark was caught without money, he would be held by a couple of the armed bulls until morning when the banks opened. Speaking of banks, let's talk about the money. As the reach of the gang expanded, they would travel across the United States and to the United Kingdom, where they fleeced a well-known producer for £3,000. As I said before, if the gang thought they had a money bag, they would go back again and again. There was a report of a school teacher in the Midwest paying $120,000 over several years. In the case of a Kansas City businessman who paid nearly $150,000, he reportedly pleaded for the criminals to kill him because he had no more money. Aside from the audacious stunt of ripping off a New York drug kingpin, to quote the film All About Eve, the award for running, standing, and jumping gall has to go to the gang's extortion of New Jersey Republican Congressman Peter Ferlinghuysen. The congressman's entrapment started in the same way as the others. Ferlinghuysen, who sat on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, was bum-rushed out of his Capitol Hill office onto a private plane to his New Jersey bank, where he paid the bulls $50,000 over two separate occasions. Retired Admiral William Church was the director of the Atlantic Division of the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Norfolk, Virginia, when he was entrapped and squeezed for money. Like the congressman, Church was escorted out of the Pentagon to his bank, where he handed over $5,000. He was not the only military man to be extorted. Two Army generals paid thousands of dollars to the scammers. Then there was the time when the team escorted a surgeon out of an operating room, forcing his colleagues to finish the surgery. In July of 1965, a detective from Manhattan's 17th Precinct got a tip that one of the gang's members, John Aitkins, was at the Western Union office in Grand Central Station impersonating a police detective. Aitkins was attempting to fleece the father of a 14-year-old runaway, telling the worried father he was a police officer and his son needed $150 for a plane ticket back to Texas. The requested funds were double the price of a plane ticket at the time, which put the father on high alert, leading him to contact the police. Once in custody, Aitkins laid out the contours of the chicken and the bull scheme, and the investigation began. In the fall or winter of 1965, Admiral Church had agreed to meet with Manhattan's district attorney, Frank Hogan, at his New York office to give evidence of his extortion, but the meeting would never take place. When Church disappeared from his home, his family grew alarmed. Admiral Church would be found in a Rockville, Maryland motel. He had shot and killed himself. He left behind a wife and two sons, one of whom was serving in Vietnam. As New York detectives ramped up their investigation, the interstate travel and furtherance of the enterprise attracted the attention of the FBI, and they soon joined the investigation. As 1965 became 1966, the enterprise grew to more than 25 bulls, traveling from state to state, setting up victims and collecting money. The FBI began informing police departments from Florida to California, enlisting them to take part in gathering witnesses and evidence. In April of 1966, FBI agents arrested the team's fixer, 47-year-old Elwood Lee Hammock. In his role as a fixer, Hammock would offer real police cash to let the arrested fake cops go. On the same day as Elwood's arrest, Sherman Kaminsky, who had already been arrested once, was arrested again. The government charged Hammock and Kaminsky with traveling across state lines to collect $11,000 from the New Jersey businessman who was framed in Washington, D.C. a year earlier. Kaminsky had already been charged, along with another bull, with extorting $20,000 from two businessmen. Also in April of 1966, the ring's leader, John Pyne, was arrested outside of his Chicago home. This time it was Pyne who was tricked and tracked, not by bulls but by the FBI. On one of his trips to New York, even his taxi driver was an FBI agent. When he was arrested, investigators found 400 documents, affidavits, and police badges the gang called buttons in Pyne's home. The government asserted the scheme had amassed over $1 million, $10 million today. Investigators found that Pyne had agreed to take only 10% of the proceeds from the scheme. After his arrest, Chicago's Internal Affairs launched an investigation into how Pyne had acquired the badges and paperwork. He was finally fired in 1966. When John Fellebaum, who had been part of the scheme from the beginning, was sentenced, the judge let him have it, maybe because Fellebaum was one of the few members of the team who had worked as both the chicken and the bull, sometimes having sex with a mark to set him up. Having pled guilty, the judge at his August 1966 sentencing read his 5-year sentence and $10,000 fine into the record. And then Judge Cooper turned both barrels on the defendant, saying, "You're very fortunate that the maximum is only 5 years. If it were 10 years, I'd sentence you to that." He went on, telling the 27-year-old Fellebaum, "In my 27 years as a judge, I've never faced a case so steeped in filth. My flesh crawled when I saw the depths you've sunk to. As a result of your filth, one person committed suicide." At the conclusion of his mid-May 1967 jury trial, former Chicago police officer John Pyne was found guilty after only 1 hour and 40 minutes of deliberation. Pyne still faced extortion charges in Texas and in New York. In the end, he was sentenced to 2 5-year terms in prison. I couldn't find an exact number of how many of the conspirators were arrested. From a rough count, I'd say between 13 and 20. The sentences seem to range from no time at all due to their cooperation to 5 years in prison. While I love Judge Cooper's moral outrage and the FBI's willingness, for the first time it should be noted, to get involved in taking down crimes committed against gay people, it's difficult to ignore that these are the very same institutions that made being gay in the United States a living hell. The moral condemnations and the legal restrictions made a scam like the chicken and the bull not only possible, but inevitable. John Pyne didn't just see people he could exploit, he understood that the system wouldn't bother to investigate. I have compassion for the young men who were the chickens in these schemes. Many of them were cast out of their homes, some of them because they were gay, some of them because they were drug addicted, all of them used as a means to an end. As for the men caught in these extortion schemes, both those who were willing to risk exposure by coming forward and testifying, and those who hid in the smoky shadows, praying that fire wouldn't consume their lives and the lives of their loved ones, I have enormous love and compassion for them all. Thanks for joining me. Please subscribe and share.